Hello, my name is Hannah and I'm a teacher from Twinkl. Thanks for joining me for daily reading. This is the second in a series of 5 videos. We've been reading Sabryna and the River Spirit. In the last video we read chapter 1 and we talked about words and phrases which capture the reader's interest and imagination. Today we're going to read part of chapter 2. Chapter 2 is a little bit longer than the other chapters, so we're going to read the rest next time. While we're reading, we're going to talk about what we can do when there are words that we don't know and we don't understand them. Here's the front cover. Let's flick forwards to chapter 2. The first thing I'd like you to do is pause the video and either tell someone, have a think, or you could even write down what you can remember about the story so far. What's been happening? Okay. In chapter 1, we met Sabryna, who lives in a village up in the hills near the beginning of a river. We learned all about her village and how the people there are using something called alchemicals to make their fertilizer better and to wash their clothes. Then we met the river spirit, Dia, who told us that the river is being damaged by these alchemicals and that people need to stop. It's Sabryna's job to send the message out. 2. Sabryna delivered the strong arm's washing and hurried home, her head spinning. Pa was beside himself when she told him. "The spirits, they heard my plea. They have blessed this house and my marvelous daughter." Sabryna tried to calm him, but he kept hooting with delight. He hooted as she served dinner, and he hooted as he thanked the gods, and he hooted as the family climbed into their beds in the cottage loft. In the morning, Pa hobbled to Mrs. Strongarm's home and asked her to watch the little ones. "We've got a long journey ahead of us, see?" he said. "We're travelling down the river, and wherever we see people causing harm, Sabryna's going to tell them to stop." That was the first Sabryna heard that her frail old Pa, with his crooked back, was planning to accompany her. "Sabryna, tell Mrs. Strongarm what Dia told you." "Oh," Sabryna found herself flushing. "Only, she said that the river is getting too polluted, you see, and that everyone should stop polluting it with alchemicals, or the plants will die and the animals will have to find somewhere else to live. So thank you for the alchemical soap, but I won't be using it." She handed the sparkling bar back. "Also, Mr. Strongarm ought to stop putting that fertilizer in his fields. It runs through the soil into the river, you know." "Nonsense! He couldn't do that, dear," said Mrs. Strongarm. "The crops wouldn't grow half so well. But I'll look after the littlies if that's what you're after," she said, flapping the children in from the doorstep. The door shut before Sabryna had time to point out that the farm had always thrived before they started using alchemicals. At home, packing her few possessions, Sabryna tried to persuade her father not to come. "Of course I'm coming," said Pa, digging out 2 old travelling cloaks. "You're only young. I will be your guide and your guard. You, my daughter, are the voice of the spirits. Now, will these do you think?" Sabryna inspected the cloaks. They were musty and ragged, but warm enough. She gave the better one to Pa, and they set off that very day. As they left the village, Sabryna stopped to speak with each person they passed. She told the blacksmith and the dyers, the merchants and their daughters all about the river. The blacksmith smiled as his iron turned to gold. The dyers nodded and dipped their gowns into their dye vats. The merchants' daughters giggled as their fathers hurried them away. It was an unpromising start. Sabryna and Pa followed the road beside the meandering river to the next village. The river was so low that it was bordered on either side by sloping beaches of red clay dotted with grey pebbles which had been carried by the river down from the mountains. Sabryna tucked one into her pocket as a talisman. Sabryna had visited the next village before on market days, but there was no market today. By the riverbank sat 3 water mills. Usually, the wooden wheels of the mills creaked in circles as the river raced past, turning the millstones inside, but not any more. The river was too low, and the mills stood still and silent. I'm going to stop there for a second. Now that we've read the first 2 pages, were there any words that you didn't recognise? It's great if there were, because we're all always learning new words, even adults. Go back through this page and find a word that you didn't know and write it down. If you can't find one, try skimming the next page for a word that you don't recognise and write that down instead. Pause the video now. I don't know what your word was, but most of the time there are ways to work out what these words mean. First, I'd like you to have your best guess at what your word means and write it down. It doesn't need to be right. I'm not sure what unpromising means. At the end of the third paragraph, it was an unpromising start. But I know it can't be a good thing because Sabryna's been having real trouble in this paragraph convincing people. So I'm just going to write down that I think this means bad. Have a go at guessing what your word means and pause the video now. Okay, let's continue reading. As I'm reading, I'd like you to write down any words that you aren't sure of, and you can look them up later. Pa and Sabryna found the millers on the common, along with some grand-looking people in richly coloured cloaks. They were surrounded by logs and bricks and strange shining contraptions. There was lots of activity, sawing and mixing and piling. "What are you doing?" Sabryna asked. "Building factories," the millers replied. "Factories? But what about your mills?" "Well, the river is too low. The mill wheels aren't turning." "Well, that's just why we're here," said Pa. "Tell them, Sabryna." Sabryna took a deep breath and began. She told the millers all about Deer's warning and the sickness of the river. As she spoke, the millers put down their tools and other villagers gathered to listen. "Well, that's all right," said one of the millers when she'd finished. "We won't be bothering about the river any more. These alchemists have devised a new way to generate power with their newfangled machinery. Uses alchemicals." "Where will the alchemicals go when you're finished with them?" The miller frowned. "Into the river, I suppose." Let's pause there for a second. On this page, people are talking about alchemicals. Based on the story so far, what do you think alchemicals might be? Pause the video now and write down your best guess. There are two ways to find out what alchemicals might be. The first one is to use something called context. Context means looking at the rest of the story and finding clues, so let's do some detective work. Here on page 11, the people are talking about the alchemicals going into the river when they're finished with. This reminds me of something which pollutes water. Maybe oil? Earlier in this chapter, Sabryna told Mrs. Strongarm to stop using alchemicals on their plants, and she handed back a bar of alchemical soap. I think that alchemicals are something that you can use to make soap, to power factories, and to make plants grow. They're also something which hurts the river. Pause the video now and write down whether your guess was correct a minute ago. If it wasn't, that's fine. Write down what we think alchemicals are now. If it was right, write down some of those clues that tell us what they are. There's another way in which we could have found out what alchemicals are. This is something called word families, which are words which have the same root but extra bits added on. Here's the word alchemicals. What word can you see inside the word alchemicals? Have a look, pause the video and write it down or tell someone. You might have spotted that inside the word alchemicals is the word chemical, or you might notice the root chem, like in chemist. A chemical is a substance made by mixing things together to make something powerful, such as disinfectant. This tells us that we're probably dealing with some sort of powerful liquid. Let's carry on reading. "Please don't," begged Sabryna. "Please don't make it worse. If you help the river thrive, it will rise and your mills will start turning again. But if you build these factories, the river might be harmed beyond repair." "Then how do you expect us to survive?" asked the miller. "We have to keep working or we won't have the means to live." "If the river dries up, no one will have the means to live," Sabryna insisted. But it didn't matter. They wouldn't change their minds. That night at their inn, Pa said, "Don't fret, Sabryna. The towns and the cities down the river are full of wiser people than these. They'll hear reason." But when they set off at dawn, Sabryna couldn't hide her worry. Pa did his best to raise her spirits. The next town sits on a lake famed for its wildlife. I went there once as a young man. I saw scarlet eagles wheeling overhead and beaklings paddling in the shallows. The banks teemed with white furs and green lace, bees and butterflies. The lake was so full of fish that it sparkled, and one moonlit night I thought I caught a glimpse of Deer's legendary serpent. Sabryna listened, mesmerized. To see Deer's serpent, the ancient creature that dwelt in the deepest, darkest parts of the river, only emerging when the moon was full, that would be quite something. They passed through a narrow gorge on the way to the town. Where the water should have raced and splashed, instead it crawled. Soon it gurgled over a short rock fall into a lake that sat in the bowl of a vast valley. The town sprawled across the northern shore. Pa gasped, "What's happened?" The lake was not at all as Pa had described. The water was murky, the banks clustered with skeletal trees and rampant weeds. There were no birds, no insects, and Sabryna couldn't imagine Deer's serpent choosing to live in a lake like this. "Oh, Pa," said Sabryna. She had no words to express how awful it was. "It just goes to show how urgent Deer's message is," said Pa. On the outskirts of the town, they passed a temple dedicated to the river spirit, and Sabryna felt her courage surge. If there was help to be had, they'd find it here. On this page, there are some tricky words. First, here in paragraph 3. I'd like you to try and use the context to work out what white furs and green lace might be on the 4th line. Don't worry if you're not sure, but think about what Pa is telling Sabryna and have your best guess. Pause the video now. If you're struggling, have a look at the sentence carefully. Pa is listing things that are on the bank. He lists white furs and green lace, bees and butterflies. If bees and butterflies are a pair of animals, what part of nature could the other two be? There's no right answer to this because the book doesn't explain what white furs and green lace are, but I think that they might be types of plants. They could be more animals, but Pa doesn't use words ending in S like bees and butterflies, so I imagine it's more like a type of plant like lavender or honeysuckle. Well done if you thought of that. There's one more word I want to look at on this page. Here, in the paragraph beginning, the lake was not at all as Pa had described. The water was murky, the banks clustered with skeletal trees. I want us to use word families to work out what this word skeletal means. Look carefully at the word and see if there are any words that are similar. Pause the video now and write down anything you can think of. This is a little tricky because there are no hidden words inside this one. If you're struggling, try taking off the last 2 letters and seeing what the word looks like. Ready? The word skeletal looks a little bit like the word skeleton. The author has turned the word skeleton, a noun, into an adjective, skeletal. Now write down what you think this tells you about the trees by the lake. Pause the video. Well done. Let's finish reading. "You'll want to speak to the fisher folk," said the priest after Sabryna had explained her mission. "You'll catch them on the docks bringing in the day's haul." So Sabryna left her father, whose back ached from long hours on the road, and headed for the water. The bank was not a gentle slope like at home, but a sheer drop from the dock. On the quayside, tens of fisherfolk dragged nets and boxes on and off shiny, alchemically powered boats. There were enough fishing boats to cover half the lake, and Sabryna wondered how they were all able to catch so many. As their engines chugged, the boats belched purple oils into the lake water, turning it deep black. No wonder the lake was sick. Sabryna peered into the boxes of tiny wriggling fish. "Those are a silver coin each," said a rasping voice in her ear. Sabryna leapt away. "A whole silver coin?" "Fish is getting harder to come by," explained a stout fisherwoman. "Supply goes down, prices go up. That's just how it is. Now are you buying?" No, thank you, said Sabryna. Don't you think that your fishing might be the problem? You're catching too much and too fast. If you stop for a while, the fish will return and there will be plenty for everyone again. The woman laughed. Stop? And then what will I live on? My family and all these others have been fishing in these waters for generations. She gestured around at her fellow fisherfolk. Exactly, begged Sabryna. You're not giving the river time to recover, and all these boats are filling the lake with fuel. There'll be no fish left at all soon. What can I do about it? The woman drawled. If I give up my engine, I'll be out of a job, and the lake will still be full of alchemical boats. She spat on the ground and turned away. Sabryna returned to the temple, feeling more hopeless than ever. But when she entered, Pa sprung from his bench like a young man. We'll have a special service here, he said. The priest has agreed. You will tell everyone your message from Dia. The service was packed, but Sabryna's voice was steady. She explained that the river was sick and low and full of awful things, that the fisherfolk were making it worse by pumping the lake full of alchemicals and taking too many fish. Everyone listened in rapt silence. At last Sabryna was being heard. But as the congregation left, she caught the gossip. Load of tosh. Stop fishing, and then what? Starve? If we listened to her, there'd be nothing left of the town. What nonsense. Sabryna tried to explain. If the river dries up, there'll be nothing left of the town either, she pleaded with them. You'll have no fish to trade, no water to drink. But they brushed her aside. Sabryna went to the inn that night and cried. Never fear, love, said Pa. Dia is on our side. She won't let us fail. The city folk will listen. Sabryna sniffed and nodded. Pa was right. He had to be. We're going to pause here, and we're going to read the rest of Chapter 2 next time. There are more questions and activities that you can do after the video. Just look at the link in the description below to find out what those are. Join me next time, where we'll be learning how to tell what characters are feeling using clues. See you then.